good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet hour of reason with you. Tell me, is there ink and paper near at hand tonight? Or perhaps a letter left unanswered? Watson trusted that even a forgotten signature might whisper its history to the patient eye. Do subscribe, so no margin goes unread. Now, settle by the lamp. For as Holmes maintained, nothing is so deceptive as a fact that seems to explain itself. Find us also on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel. The link awaits below. Chapter 1. The Honour of Chancery Lane. It was in the bleak closing days of November, when the fogs of London press so heavily upon the city that even the lamps along the embankment seemed to burn with a kind of resentful dimness, that I find the beginnings of one of the strangest cases in which I had the privilege of assisting my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The legal world of London was at that time absorbed in a matter of considerable scandal. The trial of Sir Lionel Vane, shipping magnate of great wealth, and, until recently, of unimpeachable reputation, stood accused of a fraud so vast that the city's exchanges had not ceased to murmur of it for weeks. Sir Lionel had been granted a temporary liberty, pending his trial, upon the lodging of a bail bond of £50,000, a sum so extraordinary that it had required the combined guarantee of several gentlemen of standing. The bond itself had been deposited through the chambers of Morrison, Blythe, and Keene, a firm whose name in Chancery Lane carried the same weight as the seal of the Lord Chancellor himself. So long and so honourably had it served the legal community of London. I recall that the morning in question found Holmes in a mood of indolent discontent, lounging in his armchair with the Daily Telegraph spread upon his knee, though I do not think he had read 3 lines of it. "There is nothing in the agony columns to repay the trouble of reading them, Watson," said he, tossing the paper aside with the air of a man deprived of his proper nourishment. "The criminal classes appear to have taken a holiday. You should be glad of the rest," I observed. "Rest!" he exclaimed, with something between a laugh and a groan. "I had as soon rest in my grave. Mind, Watson, is like a furnace. It must be fed, or it will consume itself." It was at this moment that we heard a hurried step upon the stair, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman whose appearance told its own story before he had spoken a word. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, dressed with the sober precision proper to his calling, but his collar was askew, his hands trembled visibly, and there was a greyness about his countenance that spoke of a sleepless night. "Mr. Holmes," said he, in a voice that he struggled to keep steady, "I am Edgar Pembroke, senior clerk to Morrison, Blythe and Keene, of Chancery Lane. I come to you upon a matter of the gravest urgency. A matter, sir, which threatens to bring ruin upon a house that has stood honourably for 60 years. "Pray be seated, Mr. Pembroke," said Holmes, his indolence vanishing as completely as snow before a fire. "Watson, the cigarettes are at your elbow. Now, sir, take your time, but omit nothing, however trivial it may appear to you." Mr. Pembroke sank into the chair we had drawn for him, and after a moment's effort to compose himself, he began his account. "You will be aware, Mr. Holmes, of the case of Sir Lionel Vane, which has occupied so much of the public attention of late. Sir Lionel was released upon bail some 3 weeks ago, the bond being lodged in our offices as is customary, pending the resumption of the trial. Bond, sir, bearing the seals and signatures of Sir Lionel and his guarantors, representing in all some £50,000, vanished from our locked archives." "Vanished," repeated Holmes softly. "A strong word, Mr. Pembroke. When was it last seen?" "3 days ago, when I myself placed it in the strong box and turned the key. Yesterday morning, when Mr. Keene required it for a routine verification, the box was found locked, precisely as I had left it. Yet the document was gone. And the consequence should it not be recovered? Sir Lionel must be returned to custody, Mr. Holmes, the bond being void without the instrument itself for production in court. The firm's name will be dragged through every newspaper in London, and the gentlemen who stood as guarantors, men of family and standing, will be called upon to answer for a sum that would beggar most of them. Holmes had listened to this recital with his fingertips pressed together, and his eyes half closed, in the attitude I had come to recognise as denoting his most concentrated attention. "Tell me," said he, "possesses keys to this archive room?" "5 persons only, Mr. Holmes. Myself, Mr. Julian Keene, the junior partner, Miss Alice Merrow, who serves as typist to the firm, and is the daughter of the late Magistrate Merrow, Horace Veal, our records custodian, a man who has served the firm for 30 years, and Captain Felix Dunn, one of Sir Lionel's guarantors, and his most intimate friend, who was given a key some months ago for a particular matter of business, and has, I confess, never returned it. 5 keys, and a door that shows no sign of forcing, I take it? No, whatever. The lock is of the most modern pattern, and bears not a scratch. And Mr. Nathaniel Prowse. I mention him, for I have read his name in connection with a case in this morning's paper. What is his relation to the matter? Mr. Pembroke seemed faintly surprised that Holmes should know the name. Mr. Prowse. Prowse is the handwriting examiner, regularly retained by the courts in cases of this character. He has already pronounced upon the genuineness of certain copies and correspondence connected with the bond, and his word, Mr. Holmes, is accepted everywhere as final. There is no more respected man in his profession. Holmes rose and walked to the window, where he stood for a moment looking down into the street, his hands clasped behind him. "It is a curious feature of human affairs, Mr. Pembroke," said he at length, without turning, that documents disappear less frequently than consciences. Paper does not walk out of a locked room of its own accord, but a man's honesty may slip away from him very quietly, while he himself remains seated at his desk, outwardly unchanged. "I think, Watson, that we must pay a visit to Chancery Lane." "You will take the case, then?" cried Pembroke, starting up, with an eagerness that was almost pitiful. "I will at least look at your archive room," said Holmes, with a smile that held more of caution than of comfort. "Beyond that, Mr. Pembroke, promise nothing, except that I shall tell you the truth, whatever it may prove to be, and whomsoever it may touch. I confess that, as I followed my friend down the stairs into the raw November air, I little guessed how far that promise would carry us, nor through what strange labyrinth of false faces and true hearts we should be obliged to pass before the truth was won." Chapter 2. The Locked Archive Room. The offices of Morrison, Blythe and Keene occupied the ground and first floors of a narrow, soot-blackened building in Chancery Lane. Its windows hung with the heavy curtains that lend to such places an air of perpetual twilight. Within, the atmosphere was one of subdued bustle, clerks moving between desks, with the noiseless tread of men accustomed to the gravity of the documents they carried, and somewhere a typewriter clattered with the regularity of a metronome. Mr. Pembroke led us at once through a panelled corridor to a heavy door at its end, which he unlocked with evident reluctance, as though the room beyond held some accusation against himself. "This is the archive," said he. "Nothing has been touched since the discovery, Mr. Holmes, by my express order. The chamber was a narrow one, lined from floor to ceiling with deed boxes and bound ledgers, and lit by a single high window of frosted glass, through which the grey morning struggled feebly. In the centre stood the strong box, black iron affair of considerable size, its lid now thrown open upon emptiness. Holmes did not go at once to the box. Instead, he stood upon the threshold. For a full minute, his eyes travelling slowly over walls, floor, and ceiling, after the manner of a man reading a page of print. "The window, I observe, has not been opened in some time," said he at last. "It is screwed fast, Mr. Holmes. We had it sealed against the damp 2 winters ago. And the chimney? There is none. The room is warmed, when at all, by a small stove, which you see in the corner, connected to the flue of the main building." Holmes crossed to this stove, an iron contrivance scarcely larger than a hat-box, and crouched beside it with the absorbed attention he might have given to a chest of buried treasure. He drew out a small lens from his pocket and applied it first to the floor about the stove, then to the stove's interior, which was cold and grey with old ash. "You permit me?" said he, and without waiting for an answer, he lifted a pinch of the ash between finger and thumb, examined it, and let it fall again. He rose, dusted his hands, and turned his attention to the shelves. Here he moved with greater deliberation, running a gloved finger along the upper surfaces, and holding it afterward to the light. "Curious," he murmured, "most curious." "What do you find, Holmes?" I asked. "I find dust, Watson, or rather, I find the absence of it where I should expect to find it in abundance, and its presence where I should expect it to have been disturbed. Upper shelves, as," he went on, addressing Pembroke, "contain, I take it, ledgers of no current interest. Old conveyancing records, Mr. Holmes, going back 20 years and more. They are scarcely consulted, and yet the dust upon them has been disturbed here and here, while the shelf immediately below, which I should suppose to be in more frequent use, undisturbed, save for a single clear path leading directly to the strong box. It is as though someone, in searching this room, troubled himself to look where nothing was to be found, and walked directly past the place where everything was kept." Mr. Pembroke looked bewildered. Holmes did not pause to enlighten him further. He turned next to examine the lock of the strong box itself, peering into the keyhole with his lens, and then, to my surprise, knelt upon the floor and examined the boards immediately before it. 5 keys. You said, Mr. Pembroke. I think we had better meet the holders of them. It was arranged that we should be presented, in turn and informally, to each member of the staff, under the pretext of a routine inquiry into the firm's security arrangements. A fiction which Mr. Keene, the junior partner, accepted with a graciousness that struck me as entirely natural. He was a young man of perhaps 30, dressed with a neatness that bordered upon elegance, his cuffs of fine French linen fastened with small gold links. He spoke readily and well, expressing on behalf of the firm the deepest anxiety, and offering every assistance. "It is a black business, Mr. Holmes," said he, smoothing one of those immaculate cuffs with an unconscious gesture. "I have scarcely slept since it was discovered." "You're concerned as you credit," said Holmes blandly, his eyes resting for a moment, and no more, upon the gold links before passing on. "Miss Alice Merrow, the typist, a quiet young woman with the pale, composed features of one trained from childhood to self-restraint. The daughter, as Pembroke had told us, a magistrate who had died some years before in reduced circumstances. She answered our questions in a low voice, her eyes seldom leaving her hands, which were folded very still upon the desk before her. "I have worked for the firm 5 years, Mr. Holmes," said she. "I cannot conceive who would do such a thing." Holmes asked her, almost carelessly, whether she had typed any documents relating to Sir Lionel's case in recent days, and she answered that she had not, beyond the usual correspondence, observed. Holmes' glance, with a swiftness that I think only I detected at the typewriter upon her desk and at the ribbon wound within it, old Horace Veal, the records custodian, was a stooped man with anxious, darting eyes, answered our questions with a nervousness so pronounced that I half expected him to confess to the theft upon the spot. His boots, I noticed, thickly caked with dried mud, though the streets of London had been dry for the better part of a week. Captain Felix Dunn we found waiting in the outer office a tall, weather-beaten man, with the bearing, at first glance, of a soldier, greeted us with a hearty bluffness that seemed designed to fill the room. "A bad business, gentlemen, a damned bad business," said he. "Tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes, this is the work of Sir Lionel's enemies. The man has made enemies enough in the city to fill a regiment, and they would stop at nothing to see him ruined." "You speak warmly in his defence," said Holmes. "He is the truest friend I have in the world, sir. I will not stand by while jackals tear at his reputation." When at length we had taken our leave and stood once more in the fog of Chancery Lane, I turned to Holmes with a question that had been forming in my mind throughout the morning. "Well, Holmes, what do you make of it? Veal's mud, the dust upon the shelves, the typewriter ribbon. You observed all these, I know." "I observed them, Watson, as I observe everything. Whether I yet understand them is another matter entirely." He drew his coat more closely about him against the chill. Veal himself suggested to Pembroke, while we were occupied with the lock, that Miss Merrow might harbour some tender feeling for Sir Lionel, and might in a moment of misguided loyalty have removed the bond to protect him. "Do you credit it?" "I credit nothing yet, to suspect everything, which is not the same condition, though the world commonly confuses them. Consider, Watson, the document was taken during a single crowded afternoon, when solicitors and clients passed constantly through those chambers, and yet it was taken from a locked box in a locked room by one of 5 persons, without the smallest sign of violence to either lock. That is not the work of a desperate hand seizing an opportunity. It has the appearance, rather, of a thing carefully prepared. Prepared for what end?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed upon the swirling fog ahead of us. "That," said he at last, "is the question upon which everything turns. A thief who steals one paper, Watson, may in fact be attempting to create another. Bear that thought with you, for I think we shall have need of it before this affair is ended." Chapter 3. The False Scandal. 2 days, in which Holmes, to my considerable surprise, made no further visit to Chancery Lane, instead occupied himself with a number of old newspapers, which he sent me to procure from the offices of 3 separate journals, and with a quantity of chemical apparatus that filled our sitting room with an odour I had learned long ago not to question. On the morning of the 3rd day, the matter was thrust violently before the public eye. I had scarcely unfolded the Morning Post when a headline of considerable size caught my attention, and I read it aloud to Holmes, who lay stretched upon the sofa with his eyes closed, though I knew well enough that he was not asleep. "Listen to this, Holmes. Startling revelations in the Vane case. Accused plotted flight to the continent. Travel documents discovered. They allege, Holmes, that Sir Lionel had arranged passage to France under a false name, to be undertaken the very week his bond vanished." "Indeed," said Holmes, without opening his eyes. And do they name the gentleman who arranged these documents on his behalf? I read further, felt a chill of something like dismay. Captain Felix Dunn, Holmes. They say he purchased the tickets himself, under an assumed name, some weeks before the bond disappeared. Holmes sat up at this, and there was a light in his eye that I had come to recognise as denoting not satisfaction, but a kind of wary interest, as a fencer might regard an unexpected feint. The public will conclude, of course, that Dunn removed the bond to facilitate his friend's escape, and then, his nerve failing him, destroyed it rather than see it used as evidence of the conspiracy, said he. It is a very tidy theory, Watson. I distrust tidy theories exceedingly. We had scarcely finished our breakfast when a telegram arrived from Lestrade, requesting our immediate presence at Chancery Lane, where the message ran. A discovery of the first importance had been made. We found the inspector standing in the archive room with the air of a man well satisfied with his morning's work, beside the small iron stove which Holmes had examined so carefully 2 days before. "We have found something, Mr. Holmes," said he, with a complacency he made no effort to disguise. "The cleaning woman, raking out the stove this morning, found this among the ashes." He held out, upon a sheet of white paper, a small fragment of charred document, perhaps 3 inches square, blackened at its edges and brittle to the touch. Upon it, in ink that had browned and faded with the heat, I could make out a portion of a signature, beneath it the broken remnant of a phrase. The word "witnesseth" and part of another I could not decipher. "It is a fragment of the bail bond itself, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade went on. "Mr. Prowse has examined it already, and pronounces the hand consistent with that of one of the original witnesses. My theory is a simple one. Someone took the bond, was overcome by remorse or by terror at what they had done, and burned it here in this very stove, perhaps only hours after taking it. A theory with much to recommend it in point of simplicity," said Holmes. "May I examine the fragment?" Strutt handed it across with the air of a man conferring a favour, and Holmes carried it to the window, where the grey light fell most strongly. He produced his lens, and for some minutes examined the charred paper in silence, turning it this way and that, and once holding it close enough to his nose that I wondered whether he meant to taste it. "You will observe, Lestrade," said he at length, "the ink of this signature has browned in a manner somewhat uneven, darker along the upstrokes, paler at the down. Now, heat acting upon ordinary iron gall ink, such as is used in legal documents, produces a browning that is tolerably uniform, chemical change proceeding at much the same rate throughout the stroke, regardless of the pressure of the pen. Pooh. This unevenness suggests to me that 2 different inks were employed in the original writing, perhaps a fault of the pen, perhaps something more deliberate." "A fault of the pen is hardly a mystery, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the faint impatience he generally reserved for what he termed Holmes's fancies. "Perhaps not. But consider also the paper itself." Holmes held the fragment to the light, so that I could see faintly a kind of mottled translucency where the fibres lay thinnest. The bail bond, I am informed, was executed upon the heavy parchment-laid paper used by the Court of Chancery for instruments of this character, a paper of distinctive manufacture, containing fibres of a particular kind, visible under magnification as fine threads of blue and red, woven into the body of the sheet itself as a precaution against forgery. "I see no such fibres here, Lestrade. This paper, unless I am very much mistaken, is an excellent imitation of court parchment. but an imitation only. Lestrade's complacency wavered, though he was not a man to abandon a theory without a struggle. Mr. Prowse examined it not an hour ago, and found nothing amiss with the signature. Do not doubt that Mr. Prowse found the signature itself entirely convincing, said Holmes with a curious emphasis that I did not at the time fully appreciate. I would ask only this, Lestrade. Has anyone yet compared this fragment directly against an authenticated specimen of Sir Lionel's hand, or against the witness's own signature, as it appears upon other documents of unquestioned genuineness? That is precisely the sort of comparison Mr. Prowse is engaged to make, Mr. Holmes, and I do not think the courts of England require a second opinion upon a man of his eminence. No, said Holmes quietly, returning the fragment with great care. No, I dare say they do not. And that, Lestrade, is perhaps the most interesting feature of the whole affair. He said no more upon the subject as we walked back along Chancery Lane. I observed that he carried himself with the particular lightness of step that, in him, denoted the dawning of some new and as yet unspoken idea. When at last I pressed him, he answered only with a question of his own. Tell me, Watson, when a man's signature is so well known, so frequently examined, and so universally accepted as genuine that no one thinks to question it, who in all London is best placed to forge it without detection? Why, said I, after a moment's thought, suppose the man whose business it is to detect such things. Holmes glanced at me with something that was almost approval. You progress, my dear fellow, you progress. We have, I think, been looking for a thief who stole a paper, when we ought rather to have been asking who stood most to gain by the world's belief that such a paper had been destroyed. Fragment you have just seen, Watson, may never have formed any part of the original bond at all. And if that is so, then someone has gone to very considerable trouble to manufacture not only a false document, but a false ending to its story. That evening we sat over our pipes. A further item of news reached us by special messenger from Lestrade. A development which Holmes remarked with a certain grim satisfaction, promised to carry the false story he had spoken of one stage further yet, to draw the threads of suspicion tighter about a man whose innocence, I confess, I had not until that moment thought to question. Chapter 4. Gentleman with the Provincial Accent. The message which Lestrade's man had brought us that evening proved, upon reading, to be of a most damaging character. It appeared that a clerk employed at the docks had come forward with information that Captain Felix Dunn had been seen, on more than one occasion during the past month, in close conference with a man named Josiah Crabb, a known forger, who had served 2 terms of imprisonment for offences connected with bills of exchange, and who was believed to have absconded to the continent some years before, only to resurface lately under a watchful eye in Wapping. It grows blacker for the captain with every hour, Holmes, I observed, as we sat over the remains of our supper. It grows blacker, Holmes agreed, which is precisely why I propose that we call upon Captain Dunn this evening. At his club, before the newspapers have had time to do their worst, Pross found the captain at the Cavendish, a club of military pretensions, somewhat faded from its former glory, seated alone in a corner of the smoking-room, with a glass of brandy before him, that I judged, from his colour, not to have been his first host. He greeted us with the same hearty bluffness as before, though I fancied there was now a certain hollowness beneath it, as of a man speaking lines he had rehearsed too often. Mr. Holmes, Doctor, you find me, in poor company, my own thoughts, gentlemen, which are dashed poor company indeed just now. I had hoped, said Holmes, seating himself without invitation, that you might give us some account of your military service, Captain. The newspapers, I observe, describe you as having served with distinction in the cavalry. 10 years and more, Mr. Holmes, in India and at the Cape. Man does not forget such years, sir, whatever else he may forget. No, said Holmes thoughtfully. I should not suppose he would. Tell me, did you find the climate of the Cape much to your liking? I am told the winters there can be remarkably severe for a man accustomed to softer airs. Severe enough, Mr. Holmes, severe enough. Though a soldier learns not to mind the weather, eh? We had worse than cold to contend with, I assure you, in those years. It was a small thing, and I confess that I should not myself have remarked it. But as the captain spoke, his careful, rounded vowels, the vowels, as I had always supposed, of a gentleman educated at one of the older schools, seemed for a moment to slip flatter. Harder note crept in, a note I associated rather with the manufacturing towns of the north than with any regiment of Her Majesty's cavalry. He recovered himself at once, and the conversation continued upon its former course. But I saw Holmes's eyes narrow very slightly, in the manner of a man who has heard a false note in a familiar piece of music. We spoke for some 20 minutes longer of the weather, the newspapers, and of Sir Lionel's prospects. The captain growing steadily more voluble upon the iniquity of Sir Lionel's enemies, till at length Holmes rose to take his leave. As he did so, he extended his hand to the captain in farewell, and I observed, with some surprise, the captain's response to this courtesy was not the easy clasp of an old soldier, but a stiff, almost military gesture. The hand brought sharply to the level of the brow, before being extended, as though some half-forgotten drill had asserted itself for an instant against his will. "A singular salute for a cavalryman, Watson," said Holmes. Once we were out in the street again, the fog pressing close about the gas lamps. "The cavalry salute, as you will recall from your own service, is given with the palm turned somewhat outward, and the hand brought to the temple, not to the brow as one accustomed to the foot regiments would render it. Captain Dunn's salute was that of an infantryman, or of no soldier at all, but of a man who has observed soldiers saluting, and reproduced the gesture as he believed it should be done. You think his military career a fabrication altogether? I think a great many things about Captain Dunn, none of which I am yet prepared to call certainties. Did you observe his coat sleeves, Watson, when he raised his glass? I confess I did not. Cuffs were worn through along the inner edge, in the manner produced by years of resting the forearm upon a desk or a counter, the wear of a clerk, Watson, not of a man who has spent a decade in the saddle. And when he spoke of the Cape, he used the phrase softer airs, a turn of speech I have heard before, though not, I think, from the lips of soldiers. It is the sort of phrase a man might use who had read of such climates in books, rather than endured them. And the forger, Crabbe, what of him? That, said Holmes, is the thread which troubles me most, and which I think we cannot leave to Lestrade's tender mercies. A man does not consort with forgers for pleasure, Watson, whatever his character. He does so because he is compelled, because he has need of their particular skill. And a man who is compelled to a course of action is very often a man with something in his past that another holds over him. We walked some distance in silence, my thoughts turning over the curious image of a false cavalry officer, his gestures and his vowels alike, a kind of borrowed costume, worn perhaps so long that the man within had almost forgotten the face beneath. Holmes, said I at last. If Dunn's identity is indeed false, does it follow that he is guilty of the theft? It follows only that he has something to conceal, which is not at all the same thing as I have remarked to you before. Man may wear a mask for shame, Watson, as readily as for crime. And it will be our business, before this affair is ended, to learn which of those motives governs Captain Dunn. He paused beneath a lamp-post, and I saw upon his face that particular sharpening of attention which I had learned to associate with the formation of some definite plan. I think, Watson, that you might render me a service tomorrow, which would occupy you a good deal more pleasantly than the dust of Chancery Lane. The War Office maintains, as you know, complete lists of officers who have served in the cavalry regiments these past 25 years. I should be obliged if you would consult them. On the pretext of your own old acquaintance, discover whether any Captain Felix Dunn appears among them, or whether perhaps some other name of similar sound might be found instead. And you, Holmes, what will you be about while I am buried in regimental rolls? I, said Holmes, drawing his collar up against the damp, shall pay a second visit to the chambers of Morrison, blithe and keen, though not, I think, during the hours when the firm is open for business. There are some inquiries, Watson, that are best conducted when the only witnesses are the dust and the silence, and I have a fancy that the archive room of our friends in Chancery Lane has not yet told us the whole of its story. With that he would say no more, parted. For the night, I to my bed and my thoughts of regimental lists, and Holmes, though I did not learn until the following day what manner of nocturnal expedition he had undertaken, nor with what curious results. Chapter 5. Performance and Sincerity. I spent the better part of the following morning at the War Office, where an old acquaintance from my Afghan days, now grown stout and grey behind a desk of considerable importance, gave me access to the regimental rolls with a freedom he would scarcely have extended to a stranger. I worked through the cavalry lists for the years in question with what patience I could muster, and found, as Holmes had half predicted, Felix Dunn recorded among them, in India, at the Cape, or anywhere else. I was upon the point of abandoning the search as fruitless, when my friend, at the desk, glancing over my shoulder, observed idly that the name put him in mind of a different matter altogether. A Felix Dunning, he said, who had some 25 years before been a junior clerk in a provincial solicitor's office, and had been dismissed, and indeed prosecuted, for the alteration of certain documents, in a manner that had very nearly ruined an innocent client. The case had been hushed up, as such cases often are, and the man Dunning had vanished from all record thereafter. I confess that I sat for some moments quite still, turning this discovery over in my mind, before I thanked my friend and made my way back to Baker Street, with what speed the cab traffic of a London afternoon would allow. I found Holmes already returned from his nocturnal expedition, seated at the breakfast table, though it was now well past noon, with the appearance of a man who had not slept at all, yet whose eyes held that particular brightness which told me his night had not been wasted. "Dunning, Watson," said he, before I had spoken a dozen words. "A Felix Dunning, dismissed for the alteration of documents, vanished from all record some 25 years since. You have done admirably. It fits very precisely into the place I had reserved for it. Then you expected as much? I expected something of the kind, though the particulars are new to me and valuable. A man who has once been taught and punished for the alteration of documents does not forget the skill, Watson, however far he may travel from the scene of his disgrace, nor however many years he may spend in honest labour thereafter. Such a man, discovering himself observed by one who knew his secret, would be very ill-placed to refuse whatever service that knowledge might be used to extract from him. You believe, then, that Dunning, I should say, was coerced into some part in this affair, but did not himself remove the bond. I believe a great many things this morning that I did not believe yesterday, said Holmes, rising and crossing to the window with the restless energy that, in him, always followed a night of activity. I had occasion to observe a meeting of a very different character, a meeting between Miss Alice Merrow and a lady whom I take to be Sir Lionel's wife, in the churchyard of St. Botolph's shortly after 8 this morning. A meeting! Holmes, this surely confirms Veal's suggestion that Miss Merrow's loyalties. It confirms nothing of the kind. I beg. You will not leap to conclusions before I have described what I saw. He turned from the window, and his manner, though still quick, had in it something graver than before. I watched these two women for upward of 20 minutes, Watson, from a position which I need not particularize. And I tell you that there was nothing in their bearing of conspiracy, nothing of the furtive glance or the whispered exchange that marks two persons engaged in a guilty understanding. Lady Vane wept. Watson wept openly, and Miss Merrow took her hand, and I think comforted her as one woman comforts another in genuine distress, with no thought for who might observe them. It was, in short, the behaviour of two people who share a sorrow, not a secret crime. Then, what is Miss Merrow's part in all this? I think Miss Merrow's part is a small and an innocent one. It has cost her some anxious nights. You will recall the typewriter ribbon, Watson, which I has examined upon our first visit, and which bore the impression of a legal's phrase absent from the firm's current correspondence. I have since had an opportunity to examine that ribbon more closely, by a method I shall not trouble you with, and I am satisfied that the phrase in question relates not to the bail bond at all, but to certain confidential drafts connected with Sir Lionel's earlier financial dealings. Drafts which Miss Merrow copied some weeks ago, in the ordinary course of her duties, and which she has since become aware touch upon matters that might, if it became known she had handled them, expose her to a charge of indiscretion, however innocent her conduct in fact. It is this fear, and not any tenderness for Sir Lionel, that has lent her manner that air of guarded anxiety, which Veal, with the malice of a frightened man seeking to deflect attention from himself, was so ready to interpret otherwise. And Veal himself. Veal's nervousness, I am tolerably certain, springs from a source a good deal more commonplace, though no less pressing to the man himself. I made some inquiries yesterday evening, before my visit to Chancery Lane, among certain persons of my acquaintance, who concern themselves professionally with the affairs of gentlemen in financial difficulty. Horace Veal, Watson, owes a sum of some £40 to a moneylender in Clerkenwell, debt of long standing and pressing interest. And it is my belief that the mud upon his boots, which puzzled us so on our first visit, acquired upon a journey to that gentleman's office, undertaken, I should imagine, in some haste, and at an hour when the omnibuses do not run. Then we have, in Veal, a man frightened by debt, in Miss Merrow, a woman frightened by indiscretion, in Lady Vane, wife frightened for her husband, and in Dunning, a man frightened by exposure. It is a perfect chorus of fear, Holmes, and not one of them, by your account, guilty of the theft. Not one of them guilty in the sense that matters, Watson. though I should not go so far as to call any of them entirely innocent. For fear, as I have observed before, is itself a kind of confession, not always a confession of the crime under investigation. There remains, however, one figure in this drama whose performance has been, throughout, entirely without flaw. And it is that very perfection which I have come this morning to regard with the gravest suspicion. You mean Prowse? I mean Mr. Nathaniel Prowse, said Holmes, and there was in his voice a note I had seldom heard there, kind of cold and deliberate precision, as of a man setting down, one by one, the pieces of a calculation he has long suspected must be true. Consider, Watson, the behaviour of every other person connected with this case. Each of them, when confronted with some new and threatening development, has betrayed some flicker of the natural feeling proper to the occasion. Fear, distress, indignation, or guilt. Mr. Prowse alone has remained throughout entirely composed. When the charred fragment was discovered, which might have been thought to vindicate his earlier judgment of the surviving signatures, he showed no satisfaction. When I cast doubt upon that fragment in his very presence, he showed no resentment. A man whose professional reputation stood, as Prowse's does, upon the infallibility of his judgment, ought surely to have shown some emotion at either circumstance. And yet he showed none at all. Perhaps he is simply a man of unusually even temper. Perhaps, said Holmes, though his tone conveyed how little weight he gave to the supposition. But I have observed, Watson, in the course of a long acquaintance with the criminal mind, that there is a difference. A difference perceptible, though not always easy to define, between the man who has nothing to fear and the man who has rehearsed, with great care, the appearance of having nothing to fear. The one is unconscious of his own composure, the other guards it, as a man guards a possession of value. I have watched Mr. Prowse upon 3 separate occasions now, Watson, and upon each occasion I have observed that guard. Practised observer must learn to distinguish the man who hides his fear from the man who rehearses his calm. And I tell you plainly, my friend, that I begin to suspect we have been looking, throughout this whole affair, in entirely the wrong direction. He would say no more that afternoon, but sat for a long while in silence, his pipe unlit between his fingers, and I knew better than to disturb him, for I had seen that look before, and I knew that some new and formidable structure of deduction was even then building itself. Stone by stone, behind that high pale forehead, a structure whose final shape I could not guess, but whose foundations I felt certain had that day been firmly and irrevocably laid. Chapter 6. The Duplicate Hand. For the next 2 days Holmes was scarcely to be seen, save at odd hours, when he would appear briefly at the breakfast table, eat little, and vanish again upon errands he did not explain. I knew better, by long experience, than to press him for an account of his movements before he was ready to give one. But I confess that the silence weighed upon me, the more so as the newspapers continued to fan the flames of public indignation against Captain Dunn, whose false military history had by now leaked, in some garbled form, to a reporter of one of the lesser journals, and who was consequently being represented as little better than a common swindler. It was upon the evening of the 2nd day that Holmes returned to Baker Street in a state of suppressed excitement which I had not seen in him for some weeks, a state betrayed only by a certain quickness in his movements, and by the fact that he flung his hat upon the sofa instead of hanging it, as was his invariable habit, upon its accustomed peg. "Watson," said he, I have spent the afternoon in the company of one of the surviving copies of the bail bond, a copy retained, quite properly, by the court itself, bearing, like the original, the signatures of Sir Lionel and his guarantors. I have also spent a considerable sum of money upon the loan, for one evening only, of a microscope of very superior quality, and upon certain chemical reagents whose smell, I fear, you will shortly have cause to regret. Will you assist me in an experiment? With pleasure, Holmes. Though I own I had thought the genuineness of those copies beyond question. Did not Prowse himself pronounce upon them? He did, Watson. That is precisely why I have spent so much trouble upon them myself. He cleared a space upon the table, one. From a leather case produced the microscope, together with a folder containing, as he explained, photographic enlargement of one of the disputed signatures, prepared for him that afternoon by a photographer of his acquaintance in Southampton Row. Now observe this signature through the lens and tell me what you see. I bent to the eyepiece, and after a moment's adjustment, found myself looking upon a great sweeping curve of black, broken here and there into the texture of the paper beneath, which under such magnification resembled nothing so much as a ploughed field. I see ink, Holmes, paper, and a quantity of small irregularities in the line, which I take to be natural to any pen stroke. Look again, Watson, the edges of the stroke, here and here. He guided my attention with a pencil point held just clear of the photograph. You will observe that along certain portions of this signature, the ink lies in a single continuous deposit, one would expect from a pen drawn freely across the paper. But along other portions, here, where the curve of the capital letter turns most sharply, the ink shows a series of minute overlaps, though the pen had been lifted and reapplied not once, but several times, each application beginning very slightly within or beyond the last. I looked again, and saw now what I had missed before, a faint but unmistakable stippling along the inner edge of certain strokes, though the line had been built up rather than drawn. It looks, said I slowly, as though it had been traced. It has been traced, Watson, traced with extraordinary skill, and with the aid, I am convinced, of some mechanical guide, device, by which an original signature may be followed point for point by a second pen, producing a copy identical in every gross particular, yet betraying, under sufficient magnification, the halting, segmented quality you have just observed. I have seen such instruments before, Watson, though they are rare, and their use requires not only the instrument itself, but a degree of skill in its handling that very few men in England possess. Fodge, then, every signature upon this copy, and, I have no doubt, upon the original bond itself, before ever it vanished from that strong box. Consider, Watson, what this means. The bond which Pembroke locked away 3 days before its disappearance was already, I believe, forgery. A forgery so perfect that it would deceive any eye but the most expert, prepared in advance, and substituted for the genuine instrument at some date before our involvement in the case began. Theft we have been investigating was not the theft of a genuine document at all. It was the removal of a forgery, and the true bond, genuine instrument bearing the true signatures of Sir Lionel and his guarantors, has been missing, Watson, not for 3 days, for very much longer, and is at this moment hidden somewhere beyond the reach of Pembroke's strong box altogether, sat back from the microscope, the implications of this unfolding before me with a kind of dizzying rapidity. But Holmes, If the bond in the strong box was already a forgery, why remove even that? Why not simply allow the forgery to be produced in court, where, if Prowse's word carries the weight you describe, it would surely have passed unchallenged? That, Watson, is the very question which occupied me during my walk home, and I believe I have its answer, though it is not a comfortable one. A forgery, however perfect, carries within it always the possibility of detection. By some accident, some chance examination, some unforeseen comparison with a genuine specimen of the signatures in question. So long as the forged bond remained quietly in the strong box, the case proceeded without incident. That risk, though small, persisted. But if the forged bond could be made to vanish, and its disappearance attributed by means of a conveniently discovered fragment, panic or remorse of some guilty party already under suspicion, then the case would never reach the point of close examination at all. Sir Lionel would be a return to cast upon the strength of the bond's disappearance alone. The question of its genuineness would never arise. True bond, wherever it lies hidden, might remain hidden forever, its absence accounted for, its existence forgotten, and the man who forged it, who possesses, as you say, both the skill and the instrument for such a task, is a man who has spent a professional lifetime examining the signatures of the great and the wealthy. Watson, who was trained by his own account, generation of clerks, in the very methods of authentication he would need to circumvent, and whose word, once given, court in England would think to question. Holmes rose and stood for a moment with his hands clasped behind him, looking down into the lamplit street. I had occasion this afternoon, before I came home, to call upon Captain Dunn, or Dunning, we must now call him, at his lodgings, and I will tell you, Watson, that the interview was a melancholy one. He confessed to me, what I believe to be perfect candour, the whole history of his disgrace 25 years ago, and of the long, careful, honest life he has built since upon its ruins. He confessed, too, that some months past he had been approached by a gentleman who knew that history in every particular, a gentleman who required of him nothing more at first than a small service, the introduction of a certain man, skilled engraver of plates, to a person of standing in the legal world for a purpose. Dunning was given to understand was entirely innocent, post. It was only later, when the engraver proved to be Crabbe, and when the purpose revealed itself to be far from innocent, that Dunning understood the trap that had closed about him. And by then, it was too late to withdraw without exposing himself, and the gentleman who approached him— did he name him Holmes? He did not know his name, Watson, for the approach was made, with great care, through an intermediary, and the gentleman himself Dunning never saw save once, at a distance, and in poor light. Holmes turned from the window, and his face, in the lamplight, wore an expression I had seen upon it only at the gravest moments of our partnership, a kind of stern and weary certainty, as of a man who has solved a problem, and finds no pleasure in the solution. But I asked Dunning one question more, Watson, before I left him. I asked him to describe, as nearly as he could, the manner of this unseen gentleman's speech and bearing at that single distant meeting. And the description he gave me, though faint and uncertain in every particular of feature, agreed in one respect. So precisely with a man we have both met, that I no longer have any real doubt as to whom we are dealing with. I did not attempt to extract the man's name from Dunning by guessing it, Watson. For I would not have my own conclusions shape his memory, but I tell you plainly, Felix Dunning never touched that bond, forged or genuine, and I believe him absolutely. Then who, Holmes, who is the gentleman? But Holmes only shook his head and reached for his pipe. "Not tonight, Watson. I have a name in my mind, but a name is not a proof. And I have learned, in 20 years of this work, that the surest way to lose a case is to speak it aloud before one is ready to defend it. Tomorrow, I think, Lestrade will have news for us, and I have a strong suspicion as to what that news will be." Chapter 7. The recovery of the bond. Holmes's prediction proved accurate sooner than even he, I think, had anticipated. We had not finished our breakfast. The following morning, when a thunderous knock announced the arrival of Lestrade himself, his face flushed with the particular triumph of a man who believes he has at last outpaced his rival. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, scarcely waiting for Mrs. Hudson to announce him.
"It is found, sir. The bond is found."
And the whole business settled, if you will believe it, in the most extraordinary manner. "Sit down, Lestrade, and take some coffee and tell us of it," said Holmes, with a composure that I, knowing what I now knew, found difficult to share. "It is old Veal, Mr. Holmes. Horace Veal, the record's custodian. One of my men, searching the archive room again yesterday evening, upon a hunch of my own, discovered a false bottom beneath the drawer of Veal's desk. A most ingenious arrangement, sir. A shallow space, scarcely 2 inches deep, concealed beneath a sliding panel. And within it, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the damp, the bail bond itself. Or what purports to be the bail bond, Mr. Holmes? For I have not yet had it formally examined, though I have no doubt of it. And Veal's account of himself? Clops entirely, Mr. Holmes, the moment the panel was lifted. Wept like a child, sir, and confessed everything. Though I cannot say his confession amounts to a great deal. He admits to having used that hiding place before, 3 or 4 occasions, over as many years, to conceal documents temporarily for certain clients who found it convenient to have a paper mislaid, for a few days, in exchange for a small consideration. A sovereign here, 2 sovereigns there. He swears, however, host, that on this occasion he acted alone, from no motive but an old habit and a moment's opportunity, and that he intended all along to return the bond once the present excitement had died down. Whether he intended anything of the sort, or whether his nerve simply failed him before he could dispose of it more permanently, I leave to wiser heads than mine. And the firm? Pembroke, Keene.
The reaction.
Relief, Mr. Holmes. Unmixed relief, as you may imagine. Mr. Keene has already sent word to Sir Lionel's solicitors, and I have no doubt the matter will be presented to the court. Within the day, the bond restored, prosecution against Sir Lionel, proceeding upon its proper footing once more, whatever that footing may ultimately prove to be. Lestrade permitted himself a smile of considerable satisfaction. I confess, Mr. Holmes, I had begun to fear this case would prove one of those tangled affairs that drag on for weeks. It is gratifying, sir, to find that sometimes the simplest explanation is, after all, the true one. Gratifying indeed, said Holmes. Might Watson and I see the document, Lestrade? A matter of curiosity merely. I should like to set eyes upon an instrument that has caused so much commotion. Lestrade, flush of his triumph, was only too willing to oblige. And within the hour we found ourselves once more in the archive room at Chancery Lane, where the recovered bond lay spread upon the very table, at which, days before, Holmes had first examined the charred fragment. Pembroke hovered nearby, his relief so evident that it was painful to witness, while Keene stood a little apart, his expression one of grave satisfaction, and Veal, poor Veal, sat huddled in a chair in the corner, guarded by a constable, his face buried in his hands. Holmes approached the table and bent over the document. For perhaps 2 minutes, no more, his lens in hand, examining it with what appeared to be the same minute attention he had given the charred fragment days before. I watched him closely and saw nothing in his manner to suggest either satisfaction or surprise. Only that same patient, methodical scrutiny, moving from signature to signature, from seal to seal, and finally, for a longer moment than the rest, to the texture of the paper itself, held up against the grey light from the high window. Then, to my considerable surprise, he straightened, returned his lens to his pocket, and said, in a tone of perfect blandness, "A most fortunate recovery, Mr. Pembroke. I congratulate you. You are satisfied, Mr. Holmes, that it is genuine?" Pembroke, eagerly. "Mr. Prowse has not yet seen it, but I had thought to send for him at once, as a final formality, before it is returned to the court." "By all means send for Mr. Prowse," said Holmes. "I am sure his judgment will set every mind at rest. Prard." And with that he turned away, gathered his hat and stick, and made for the door with a briskness that left Lestrade staring after him in some bewilderment, and left me, I confess, hardly less puzzled than the inspector. We did not speak until we were well clear of Chancery Lane, walking northward through streets grown suddenly bright with a thin and watery sunshine, the first we had seen in some days. "Holmes," said I at last, unable to contain myself longer. "You said nothing, you raised no objection. And yet I could see by your manner that you were not satisfied, bond not genuine." "The document has been found, Watson," said Holmes slowly, "precisely where one would wish it to be found. In the possession of a man whose previous conduct made his guilt entirely plausible, who has confessed with every appearance of sincerity, and whose confession, conveniently, extends only so far as to account for the document's concealment, and not 1 inch further. It is, in every particular, a solution that closes the case as neatly as a door, Watson, and it is that very neatness which I distrust. But the document itself, was it the forgery you described last night, or the genuine instrument? I will tell you this much, Watson. Paper of the recovered bond bears, or appears to bear, the watermark fibres proper to genuine Chancery parchment, fibres which, you will recall, were absent from the charred fragment Lestrade showed us. To the eye, and I think to any examination short of the most exhaustive, this document will pass as the true bond, restored to its rightful place, the case closed, the firm vindicated, poor Veal left to bear whatever burden of guilt the world chooses to lay upon him. Then it is genuine. I did not say so, Watson. I said it appears genuine. And there is a difference between those two statements which I am not yet in a position to demonstrate, though I believe with my whole heart that it exists. Consider the timing of this discovery, Watson. We have spent some days establishing, to my own satisfaction at least, that the bond originally taken from the strong box was itself a forgery, substituted for the genuine instrument before ever the theft was reported to us. If that is so, then the genuine bond has been missing, concealed somewhere, since before our involvement began. Is it not a very great coincidence that, precise moment when our inquiries had begun to point toward forgery, toward Prowse, toward a conspiracy, reaching far beyond the walls of this archive room, at that very moment, a document should be discovered in a hiding place known to exist, in the possession of a man already burdened with a guilty conscience over lesser matters. A document which, upon cursory examination, appears in every respect genuine, and which, once restored, will close this case forever and silence every question we have raised. You believe it was planted then, planted for us or for Lestrade to find? I believe, said Holmes, that someone has gone to very great trouble to give us precisely the ending we were expected to want. An ending in which a frightened old man's petty dishonesty accounts for everything, and in which no one need ever examine, with the care that I have given it, the question of whether the bond now lying upon that table is truly what it appears to be. It is a solution offered, Watson, with all the smoothness of a card dealt by a practised hand, and I have learned, in a long career, that the card one is shown with such confidence is very rarely the card one ought to choose. He said no more upon the subject for the remainder of our walk, but I observed that his step had quickened, and that his eyes, fixed upon the pavement before him, held the abstracted brightness of a man whose mind has already outrun his feet and is and pursuing through some labyrinth invisible to his companion the final threads of a pattern whose centre he believes himself at last to have glimpsed. Chapter 8. The man who verified himself. For the remainder of that day Holmes shut himself into his room, and I heard him moving about within for hours, the sounds suggesting now the shifting of books, now the rustle of papers, now a long silence that I took to mean he sat motionless in his chair, lost in that peculiar inward concentration which no interruption, however urgent, could ever quite penetrate. I dined alone, and read, and dined again upon the cold remains of the first meal, when Holmes did not appear, and it was not until close upon midnight that his door opened and he came out, pale, unshaven, but with the look of a man who has, after long labour, brought some great structure to its completion. "Watson," said he, "I believe I have it, the whole of it, from beginning to end. Sit down, for I think you should hear it before I act upon it, if only that you may tell me whether I have allowed my reasoning to outrun my evidence. I am all attention, Holmes." He drew his chair close to mine and began, in the quiet, measured tone he reserved for the unfolding of his most considered conclusions. "Let us begin, Watson, not with the theft of the bond, with a question I posed to you some days ago, and which I think we are now in a position to answer. I asked you who, in all London, best placed to forge Sir Lionel's signature, and the signatures of his guarantors without fear of detection. You answered, perfect correctness, that it must be the man whose business it was to detect such things. And there is, in this case, only one such man, whose word carries the weight necessary to place a forgery beyond all question. Nathaniel Prowse has spent 30 years building a reputation for infallibility. He has examined the signatures of half the great houses of England. His judgments have never, to my knowledge, been successfully challenged. It is a reputation, Watson, of immense value and immense danger, for a reputation so absolute admits of only one use to a man inclined toward crime. It permits him to authenticate his own forgeries, to have that authentication accepted by judges and juries alike as beyond the reach of doubt. But, Holmes, what motive could such a man have? He stands at the very pinnacle of his profession. What could he gain by risking it all? I asked myself that question, Watson, and I confess it troubled me longer than any other element of this case, until I recalled something I had read, some weeks ago, in connection with an entirely different matter. You will recall the collapse, some 3 years since, of the Anglo-Colonial Investment Trust, failure that ruined a number of small investors and ended, eventually, in a parliamentary inquiry. Vaguely, Holmes, I remember the newspapers were full of it for a time. Sir Lionel Vane gave evidence before that inquiry, Watson, evidence which, by all accounts, decisive in establishing the fraudulent character of the Trust's management, and which led directly to the prosecution of its directors. It is a matter of public record, though buried now in old newspaper files, that one of the principal shareholders of that trust, a gentleman who had invested very heavily, and who lost, in consequence of its collapse, a sum, I am informed, approached £15,000, was none other than Mr. Nathaniel Prowse. I sat back, pieces of the puzzle arranging themselves before me, with a suddenness that left me almost breathless. Revenge, then, Holmes, not for any wrong done to Prowse personally by this present case, but for an injury 3 years old which Sir Lionel's testimony brought upon him. Revenge, Watson, though revenge of a peculiarly patient and calculating character, befits the man. Consider the elegance of the scheme once you grasp its true purpose. Prowse did not seek merely to see Sir Lionel imprisoned, though that would be satisfaction enough to a lesser man. He sought to see him imprisoned in such a manner that no one, not Sir Lionel, not his solicitors, not the courts themselves, should ever suspect that anything irregular had occurred. The genuine bond, Watson, was removed from the firm's possession. At some date we have not yet established, replaced with a forgery so perfect that only the most exhaustive examination, an examination which Prowse, as the recognised authority, were called upon to conduct, would naturally be called upon to conduct, and would naturally pronounce satisfactory, could ever detect the substitution. And then the forged bond, too, was removed. Removed, Watson, at precisely the moment calculated to inflict the maximum injury with the minimum risk. Consider, had the forged bond simply remained in the strong-box and been produced in court, there would always exist some small possibility, however remote, that some sharp-eyed clerk, some chance comparison, might detect the substitution and the whole elaborate structure would collapse, implicating Prowse directly. But if the forged bond could be made to vanish, its disappearance attributed to panic, to remorse, to the desperate act of some minor figure already burdened with suspicion, then Sir Lionel would be returned to custody. Upon that ground alone, the bond's genuineness would never be tested at all. The question of forgery would simply never arise. The Prowse's first attempt to provide such an explanation, a fragment of imitation parchment, bearing a signature traced in the same hand as the forged bond itself, intended to suggest that the document had been destroyed by some guilty hand in a moment of weakness. But the fragment failed to convince you. The fragment failed because Prowse, for all his skill with a pen, is not a chemist, Watson, could not know that heat acts upon different inks at different rates, nor that the watermark fibres of true chancery parchment cannot be reproduced by any process of imitation known to me. It was a flaw invisible to the eye, but not to the lens, and I think, Watson, that when Prowse learned of my interest in that fragment, he understood that a more elaborate diversion would be necessary. The recovery of the bond from Veal's desk. Just so, Veal's hiding place, Watson, was no secret to anyone who had worked in that office for any length of time. Pembroke himself told us. You will recall Veal had used it before, for small and venial purposes, and I have no doubt that his previous lapses were common knowledge among the senior staff, including Prowse, who has had the freedom of those chambers for years in his professional capacity. What more natural than that, the genuine bond, recovered at last, from wherever it had truly been concealed these past weeks, should be slipped into that very hiding place, there to be discovered by Lestrade's men, its recovery accounted for, by Veal's known weakness, the case closed forever, with the true bond restored to its place, the forgery destroyed beyond recall, in the shape of that charred fragment, and not one person in England the wiser as to what had very nearly occurred. Then, the document we examined this morning is, I believe, the genuine bond, Watson, restored, precisely because its restoration ends the matter more completely than its continued absence ever could. Missing bond invites questions. A recovered bond, found in the hands of a known petty offender, invites none. It is, as I said this morning, dealt with all the smoothness of a practised hand, and it very nearly persuaded even Lestrade, who is not, whatever his limitations, unintelligent man. But Holmes, if the bond is genuine and restored, what proof remains of any of this? Prowse has committed no crime that the law can touch. If the genuine document is once more in its proper place, and the forged copy destroyed, Holmes rose and crossed to the window, where the first grey light of dawn was beginning to show above the rooftops opposite. There remains, Watson, one piece of evidence which Prowse, for all his cleverness, cannot have destroyed. For it is not a document at all, but a habit. And habits, my dear fellow, are very much harder to burn than paper. I spoke, you will recall, mechanical instrument, by which a signature may be traced, point for point. An instrument rare enough that I can name, with some confidence, every workshop in London capable of constructing one to the necessary precision. I have spent this evening, Watson, not in idle reflection, but in correspondence with 3 such workshops, and I have this hour received a reply from the third and last of them, confirming that just such an instrument was constructed, some 4 months ago, to the order and specification of a gentleman answering, in every particular, to the description of Mr. Nathaniel Prowse. Then you have your proof. I have a thread, Watson, which I believe will unravel the whole garment if pulled at the proper moment, and before the proper witnesses. Prowse has been summoned, has he not, to give his formal verification of the recovered bond before the assembled partners and Lestrade tomorrow morning? It is, I think, the very occasion at which such a thread ought to be pulled. For a man who has spent his life persuading others of his own infallibility is never more vulnerable than at the moment he is asked, once again to perform that very office, before an audience that does not yet know it is about to witness. Not a verification, but a confession. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the constructed identity. The verification had been arranged for 11 o'clock, in the principal conference room of Morrison, Blythe and Keene, a chamber I had not before entered, hung about with portraits of solemn gentlemen long since deceased, whose painted eyes seemed, that morning, to look down upon the proceedings with an especial gravity. There were assembled when Holmes and I arrived the senior partner, Mr. Blythe, a thin, dry old gentleman whom we had not previously met, Mr. Keene, immaculate as ever, Pembroke, hovering near the door with the anxious solicitude of a man who feels himself somehow responsible for whatever may occur, Lestrade, comfortable in the conviction that his part in the affair was nearly done, and, seated a little apart from the rest, with the bond itself spread upon the table before him, Mr. Nathaniel Prowse. I observed him with new eyes that morning, knowing what Holmes had told me, and I confess I could detect nothing in his appearance to mark him as other than what he had always seemed. A spare, grey, precise gentleman of perhaps 60 years, his hands folded before him, with the stillness of a man entirely at his ease, his eyes, when they rested upon Holmes, betraying neither curiosity nor alarm, but only the mild, faintly impatient courtesy of an expert who has been called from more pressing business to confirm what he already knows. "Mr. Holmes," said Blythe, with the air of a man performing an unwelcome duty. "Inspector Lestrade has informed us that you take some interest in this matter, though I confess the firm regards it as concluded. Mr. Prowse has kindly consented to give his formal opinion of the recovered document, after which I trust we may all return to our proper occupations." "By all means, let Mr. Prowse proceed," said Holmes pleasantly, seating himself, uninvited, at the foot of the table. "I should be most interested to hear his methods explained. For the benefit, if I may say so, those of us less versed in such matters." Prowse inclined his head, with the faint condescension of a master addressing pupils, drew the bond toward him. "The examination of a signature, gentlemen, proceeds upon several established principles," he began, in the dry, even voice I had heard before. "The consistency of pen pressure, the formation of individual letters, when compared against authenticated specimens, the general character of the hand, which, like a man's gait or the timbre of his voice, varies little throughout his life." He bent over the document, drew from his case a glass not unlike Holmes's own, and applied it with practised ease to the first signature. This signature, that of Sir Lionel Vane, corresponds in every particular with specimens I have examined on previous occasions. Pressure is consistent, the formation of the capital V entirely characteristic. "Without reservation," repeated Holmes softly. "A bold word, Mr. Prowse, for so delicate a science. Tell me, in the course of your examination, did you have occasion to consider the possibility that a signature, though perfect in every detail you have named, might nonetheless have been produced, not by the hand it purports to represent, by a mechanical instrument capable of tracing that hand's characteristic movements with absolute fidelity?" There was a brief silence in the room. Prowse looked up, and for the first time I saw something pass across that composed countenance. Not alarm precisely, but a kind of swift recalculation, as of a man who finds an unexpected card has been played, and must adjust his own hand accordingly. "Such instruments exist, Mr. Holmes, in theory," said he after the briefest pause. "In practice, their use would require a degree of access to genuine specimens, and a degree of mechanical skill that places the possibility very nearly beyond consideration." "And yet," said Holmes, "such an instrument was constructed, some 4 months ago, by a workshop in Clerkenwell, to the specifications of a gentleman who gave his name, Hogood, upon that occasion, as Mr. Nathaniel Crane. I know nothing of any such instrument, Mr. Holmes, nor of any Mr. Crane." "No," said Holmes. "I did not suppose you would admit to it, but the workshop in question, Mr. Prowse, retains, as is customary, a description of its clients for the purposes of its accounts. And I have here—" He produced from his pocket a folded paper, a description which I think this company will find singularly familiar. He read it aloud, a description of height, of bearing, of a particular manner of adjusting spectacles before examining fine work, and I saw Blythe's dry old face turn, slowly, toward Prowse, with the dawning horror of a man who recognises, in a stranger's words, the unmistakable portrait of his own colleague. "This is preposterous," said Prowse, but his voice, for the first time, had lost something of its even precision. "A description, Mr. Holmes, fits 1,000 men. Perhaps, let us set it aside, then, for the moment, turn to another matter. The matter of Captain Felix Dunn, whose true name, as some of you may by now have learned, is Felix Dunning, dismissed 25 years ago from a solicitor's office for the alteration of documents." Holmes turned to address the room at large. "Captain Dunn has been represented in the newspapers, and I think in the minds of several persons present, a man whose false identity marks him as the likely author of this whole affair. I wish to state plainly, and at once, that this is not the case. Dunning's false identity is a private tragedy of long standing, wholly unconnected with the disappearance of any document, save in this single particular, that it rendered him vulnerable to the man who discovered his secret and used it to compel his unwitting assistance. You accuse Dunning of nothing, then, said Lestrade, with the bewilderment of a man who feels the ground shifting beneath a case he had thought solid. I accuse Dunning of cowardice, Inspector, which is not a crime, though it is sometimes mistaken for one. I accuse him of nothing else. Holmes rose now and stood at the head of the table, and I saw that every eye in the room, even Prowse's, was fixed upon him. The true history of this case, gentlemen, is this. Some months ago, Mr. Nathaniel Prowse, nursing a grievance 3 years old against Sir Lionel Vane, a grievance arising from testimony Sir Lionel gave before a parliamentary inquiry, testimony which cost Mr. Prowse a personal investment of some £15,000, conceived a scheme of revenge so patient and so precisely calculated that it very nearly succeeded without arousing the smallest suspicion. He laid the matter before them then, point by point, much as he had laid it before me the night before. The genuine bond removed and concealed, the forgery substituted in its place, charred fragment manufactured to suggest its destruction, and Dunning manipulated, through the threat of exposure, into bringing Crabbe the forger into contact with the scheme at its earlier stages. And the bond now upon this table, Holmes concluded, which Mr. Prowse was about to pronounce genuine, is in fact the original instrument restored to its place, at the very moment most calculated to close this matter forever. Its recovery attributed to poor Veal's known weakness, its true history buried beyond all hope of discovery, save for one circumstance which Mr. Prowse could not have foreseen. And that circumstance, Mr. Holmes? Asked Blythe, in a voice that had sunk almost to a whisper. That the genuine bond, gentlemen, like the forged copy before it, bear the watermark, fibres proper to true chancery parchment. Fibres which I examined with great care in this very room 2 days ago, upon the document Lestrade's men recovered from Veal's desk, and which I tell you now, before you all, were entirely absent. Profound silence fell upon the room. Then Prowse, very slowly, rose from his chair, and in the same instant, with swiftness astonishing in a man of his years, he turned toward the door. But Lestrade, to his credit, was quicker still, and in a moment the inspector's hand had closed upon his arm. "I think, Mr. Prowse," said Holmes quietly, into the silence that followed, "that you had better sit down again and tell us where the true bond is to be found." Chapter 10. The Restored Name. For a long moment, Prowse stood motionless within Lestrade's grasp, and I watched the last of that careful composure drain from his face, leaving behind it something I had not expected to see. Not defiance, nor even fear, but a kind of weary relief, as of a man who has carried a heavy burden so long that its setting down, however ruinous, comes almost as a mercy. "You will find it," said he at last, in a voice from which all its dry precision had gone, "in the false bottom of a dispatch case in my chambers at the Temple. I had not yet decided what to do with it. I think, gentlemen, that I had not truly decided upon any of this, from the very beginning, only that each step seemed, at the time, to follow inevitably from the last. That is very often the way of such schemes, Mr. Prowse," said Holmes, not unkindly. "A man persuades himself that he commits one small wrong only, and finds, too late, the wrong has grown a life of its own, and dragged him with it. Lestrade, recovering himself, dispatched 2 constables at once to the Temple, instructions to search the dispatch case Prowse had described. And within the hour they returned, bearing between them a leather case of the kind favoured by gentlemen of the law, from whose lining, beneath a panel, so cunningly fitted, that I doubt any but the most thorough search would ever have discovered it, drawn the genuine bail bond. Its parchment, when Holmes examined it, showing under his lens those faint threads of blue and red that had been so conspicuously absent, both from the charred fragment and from the document. Prowse had been about to authenticate that very morning. Prowse made no further attempt at concealment. Seated once more at the table, with Lestrade now standing close beside him, he gave, in the same flat, exhausted voice, full account of the scheme, the slow accumulation of his grievance against Sir Lionel over 3 years, the discovery, almost by accident, Dunning's old disgrace, and the use he had made of it, the construction of the tracing instrument, under a false name, by the workshop in Clerkenwell, the long and patient substitution of the forged bond for the genuine one, accomplished, he admitted, during a routine examination some weeks before, when he had been left alone with the documents for the better part of an afternoon. And finally, the manufacture of the charred fragment, and the planting of the recovered bond in Veal's hiding place, the existence of which he had indeed known of for years, as Holmes had surmised. "I had thought it perfect," said he, when his account was finished, and there was in those words something almost plaintive. "I had thought no one in England could detect it, save myself, and it did not occur to me, Mr. Holmes, that there might exist a man whose eye was sharper than my own." "There is always such a man, Mr. Prowse," said Holmes gravely, "though he is not always at hand when he is needed. You built your scheme upon the assumption that your own judgment was beyond question, and it was that very assumption, more than any single error of execution, which betrayed you. A man who believes himself infallible ceases, by that belief alone, to examine his own work as critically as he examines the work of others. There is little more to relate. Sir Lionel Vane, the genuine bond restored to its proper place, was permitted to remain at liberty, pending the resumption of his trial. A trial whose outcome, I may say, lies beyond the scope of this narrative, and upon which I shall offer no opinion, save that it is no part of a detective's office, his chronos, to determine the guilt or innocence of a man upon charges quite separate from the one we had been called to investigate. Prowse was committed for trial upon charges of forgery and conspiracy, charges which, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence Holmes had assembled, he did not attempt to contest. And his fall, when the newspapers at last got hold of the story in its true form, was as complete and as sudden as his former eminence had been absolute. The others, I am glad to relate. The outcome was kinder than the early days of the affair had given any reason to hope. Felix Dunning's false history, once its true circumstances became known, that he had been the unwitting victim of blackmail rather than its author, excited, among those who learned of it, more sympathy than censure. He resigned, of his own accord, from the Cavendish Club, from the military pretensions he had worn so long. But Holmes, who called upon him once more before the matter was closed, told me afterward that Dunning had spoken of beginning life again, under his true name, in some distant corner of the country where his old disgrace was unknown, and Holmes, for his part, had offered no discouragement. "False beginning, Watson," said he, as we walked back back to Baker Street that evening does not always produce a false man. Dunning's crime was committed 25 years ago by a young man under pressures I have no doubt were considerable, and he has spent every year since in honest, if anxious, labour. I see no profit and a good deal of cruelty in pursuing him further. Horace Veal's part in the affair, once examined in its proper light, proved to amount to nothing more than the lesser misconduct he had already confessed. The occasional concealment of a paper for a small bribe, a habit of long-standing and venial character, quite unconnected with Prowse's scheme save that Prowse had made cynical use of it. He retired from the firm shortly afterward, his pension, I am glad to say, left untouched by the affair, and I believe he removed to live with a married daughter in Surrey, where I trust the air agreed with him better than the dust of Chancery Lane. As for Miss Merrow, her quiet courage, for it had taken courage, Holmes observed, for a woman in her position to maintain her composure under the suspicion that had briefly fallen upon her, without once betraying the confidential matters that were the true source of her anxiety, earned her, when the full story became known, measure of public sympathy that I think did much to ease the difficulties her position might otherwise have brought her. Morrison, Blythe, and Keene, far from being disgraced, found their reputation, if anything, enhanced by the episode, the firm's name becoming, in the weeks that followed, byword for the very thoroughness that had, however inadvertently, helped to expose the fraud. That evening, we sat once more in our familiar chairs at Baker Street. The fire burning cheerfully against the November chill, I found myself reflecting upon the singular character of the case we had just concluded. A case in which no blow had been struck, no shot fired, and yet in which the stakes, for several of those involved, had been as great as any I had known. "It is curious, Holmes," said I, "how many false faces we have encountered in this affair, and how few of them concealed any true wickedness. Dunning's false name concealed only shame, Veal's nervousness only debt, Miss Merrow's reticence only a young woman's natural caution. Only Prowse, all of them, was truly what he seemed to be, and that was the one face none of us thought to question. You have put your finger, Watson, upon the very heart of the matter," said Holmes, settling back into his chair and reaching for his pipe with the air of a man well content with his evening's repose. "It is not the discovery of lies that constitutes the detective's true art. For London, Watson, is full of lies, great and small, and a man who could not distinguish one falsehood from another would drown in them within a week. True art lies in discerning which falsehoods conceal wickedness, and which conceal only shame or fear or sorrow. For they wear, very often, an identical face, and only the most patient examination can tell them apart." He lit his pipe, and for a while neither of us spoke, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of traffic in Baker Street. "In London, Watson," said he, at last, that dry note of irony I had come to know so well. "Forged identities are common enough. The true rarity is a forged conscience," and with that he drew his dressing gown more closely about him, and said no more that night.